This is 7th Circle Gaming, and today we're going to be analyzing the latest brand strategy game from the Paradox Game Studio, Victoria 3. And we'll get started here very quickly with full disclosure, and you're very welcome to pause the video now and read through this at your leisure, or if you prefer not to, don't pause the video and let's jump right into the screenshots, because this is a frankly very large and very complex game. One of the seemingly unique aspects of the game pops up very quickly as soon as players push the New Game button. They're greeted with this screen where they have the option of selecting what passes for a tutorial mode called Learn the Game, or three other options that are based on what the player's victory conditions are going to be, whether it's economic victory, military victory, or a cultural victory. Just to borrow the language of the Civilization series for a moment, or if players prefer to play a more free-form mode or create their own custom rule sets, they can choose the Sandbox mode, which gives players the freedom to create their own rules of the game world from the options available on this screen. How exactly those are going to impact the world is something that's best experienced rather than explained. And speaking of the game world that players are going to inhabit, let's take a look at what that looks like. From the highest level, the game world looks like this. Obviously, this is from when we've already chosen a country, but it is illustrative of the general principle. What we're seeing is something very much like a child's Atlas jigsaw puzzle. Very simple shapes, everything is color-coded. Now, once players zoom in, the game gets a lot more visually interesting, with an unartistically rendered but still realistic version of the world. On this screenshot, we also want to illustrate to you or share with you the user interface. A couple of things to point out is in the top left-hand corner of the screen are mostly the economic and social indicators, followed by, on the left-hand side, the menu options, and then on the bottom, where some other Paradox games had a menu on the bottom right corner, this one is chosen to place all of the different display options at the bottom. The right-hand side of the screen, probably why they moved a lot of display options, is going to be taken up very quickly, frankly, with notifications. And since there really isn't much more to say about this without revealing spoilers or, well, getting overly embroiled in the complexity, let's move on to our screenshot, which we're going to share with you to attempt to illustrate the sheer amount of complexity that the game has. And as I was writing this analysis, or coming up with the analysis, I struggled to come up or find an image that would as accurately or as completely communicate the complexity as I really think this one does. What we're looking at is a paper mill in the Kingdom of Sweden. And what makes this illustrative of the level of complexity in Victoria 3 is that players can choose whether or not machines are used to assemble paper. They can also choose whether or not the factory is state-owned, some sort of a profit-sharing agreement, or any one of about 6 other options. Players can also choose whether to make low-quality paper, high-quality paper, or various other options. And there are a few games that are going to provide players with that amount of complexity, or that amount of detail, rather, when it comes to selecting the production methods of a factory that they've built. And it's not just paper mills, obviously, that have this. Even the government administration buildings and even the military units have this level of complexity attached to them. So then, let's move right along before we get far too invested in this and talk about immersion. And Victoria 3 has earned an 8.5 out of 15 for immersion. The presentation, as we've just suggested, is a top-down, very aesthetically rendered, but still realistic portrayal of the globe. The game is also going to be using agency to get players invested into the game world. We would also call this immersion storytelling, possibly, in the sense that the player's decisions shape the world as it develops over the course of their play session. The game also uses statistics focus to get players invested into the game world, and really that's what that last screenshot was all about, illustrating the sheer amount and the level of statistics that the game has, down to a very small level. If players can choose whether or not a paper factory uses machines, or all of the paper produced by the factory is done by. Finally, the game is going to be using challenge to get players invested into the game world, and the amount of challenge and the exact form that the challenge takes is going to depend greatly on which country the player chooses. Countries like the Republic of Texas that are struggling for independence are going to be a different sort of challenge than playing as China in this time period. The pace of the gameplay and the notifications, the pace that those notifications pop up is going to only add to this sense of challenge. So then let's move away from challenge and start talking about difficulty. Victoria 3's difficulty is primarily going to come from all of the behind-the-scenes calculations that the game is making. Now, the question we want to answer is, are there design decisions and development decisions that negatively impact that difficulty? Well, there are some things that are certainly different. Players selecting a rules set rather than selecting easy, medium, or hard is going to impact the player's enjoyment of the game or impact the difficulty. It describes those rules only vaguely. As we said earlier, it's best learned what those do through experience rather than necessarily a complete explanation. As we said earlier, the player choice of country is going to impact difficulty as much as it does the challenge. So, especially with Victoria 3, there's a lot of interplay between the immersion and the difficulty, sometimes to the point that it's hard to say whether or not, let's say, the user interface and the amount of complexity is necessary for the immersion, or whether it's a negative decision because it impacts the difficulty by making it far too complicated for the average player. And for that reason, the game has earned a 5 out of 15. So then, let's move on to the lasting appeal and ask what is going to keep players playing through the game, what's going to keep it installed on hard drives. And on this category, Victoria 3 has earned an 8 out of 15. There are multiple countries to choose from with unique starting conditions. Obviously, there are things that are going to be in common across all of the countries. There are no really unique technologies that we've uncovered. There are, however, some unique legal systems and unique laws, or seemingly unique laws. The game does allow or does have mod support, and there is likely to be DLC released as the game matures. Certainly, players may find some lasting appeal by selecting a different victory condition from that menu that we shared with you at the start of the game, or at the start of the video, or creating their own custom rules sets. The game will support play for as long as the player has free time to devote to it, although using the time dilation over much could cause some details to be missed. And now where the rubber meets the road here is that Victoria 3 covers the time period 1836 to 1935, roughly 99 years, and players familiar with this time period and the events that occurred, for example, the First and Second Opium Wars, may derive more lasting appeal from it than players that aren't overly familiar with things like the reign of Louis Napoleon, or, well, pick your historical event, the Texan Revolution. And on that note, I won't continue any further. Let's move on to overall score. Overall, Victoria 3 has earned a 7.16 out of 15. Certainly, the game is visually impressive. There are multiple layers of complexity, to the point that it could be called overwhelming by some players. It's certainly possible to say that there are diminishing returns for Victoria 3. That's where things like DLC and mods will come in handy and provide a longer period of enjoyment, for want of a better phrase. The game does issue tutorials for learning by doing. One thing that we would say that when it comes down to deciding whether or not to purchase the game, there's a couple of questions or a couple of conditions. First, as we said in the lasting appeal, is this a time period that the player is really interested in? Paradox has produced enough games about enough time periods that for anyone with an interest in the Napoleonic Wars or the early Enlightenment to the start of the French Revolution, there's a game for that. If ancient history is really something the player's interested in, great, Imperator Rome is there. For the speculative future, Stellaris is there. Or the Age of Exploration, great, Europa. The early medieval to the late medieval, Crusader Kings. And on that note, we will just add very quickly that if certainly there's always the justification of saying, well, we have to have the newest game from the studio to support them, and there's also the justification of saying that, well, we've got all these friends that are going to be playing the game and we want to play with them, so we're going to purchase it. And certainly we can't say anything about that. But for playing as a single-player game, the interest in the time period is going to be something that carries the player through the complexity more than anything else will. And on that bombshell, from 7th Circle Gaming, good.